Mic check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and a lot of people feel like they did not get a good deal on a retro video game unless they paid under $10 for it. And then you have other people who feel like it's really based on the percentage of the current market value. So, for instance, let's say a game is currently going for $30. If you were able to get it at 60% off, then you got a great deal, right? And then there are other people who feel like, it's okay to pay market value for a game. They don't mind paying whatever the market is asking for the game, as long as, they're not being fleeced, as long as they don't feel like they're being overcharged for games, and, they're getting at least somewhat of a fair market price or a fair market deal on the game. Now, I think, the concept of fair market, or really the concept of what a good deal is for a retro video game, it kind of shifts as the market shifts. So what do I mean? What I mean is that if you were paying, let's say, fair market price for a retro game back at the beginning of 2020, then I think a lot of people were probably more willing to do that, because the general idea back then was that the prices of retro games were going up and would continue to go up for the foreseeable future at that time. The way prices were just ballooning incredibly quickly, I don't think people had as much of an issue paying fair market for certain retro video games, or really all retro video games, just because of the craze and the madness that was going on. We were really in uncharted territory in terms of just what was happening around the world, with just everything that was happening and in 2020. And so I think, if someone told you that you needed to pay $60 for a certain Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis game, I think a lot more people were more willing to do that back then. Now, of course, times were different. Money was more free flowing. Pretty much all major bills were suspended, including mortgages, student loans, rents, things of that nature. There were more moratoriums all over the place. People were getting forbearances left and right. And so it was just a lot easier to spend that money. But I think now, here in 2025, as we come to the end of the year, the idea of paying a fair market price, or paying market price for a retro game, has a completely different feeling to a lot of collectors and folks that would want to purchase retro video games. And I feel like the reason for that is because the concept has really swung in the other direction. I don't think that the sentiment towards the retro game market is the same. Not I think. I know that the sentiment towards retro game collecting and the perceived value of retro video games isn't the same today as it was a few years ago. I think today a lot of people have a more of an issue paying market price for retro games, because the idea is really that the retro game prices are going down for certain games. And we are seeing what some might call a market correction, or just the bubble has burst, or the balloon in the retro gaming market has popped. Call it whatever you want to call it. I call it just people not really having the disposable income anymore to spend that kind of money on retro video games, because video games are really considered a non-essential. And during times where you really have to focus on the essentials like food, gas, shelter, so on and so forth, a lot of people aren't really looking at it that way. And then on top of that, the speculators, the people who thought that they could make a quick buck buying and flipping video games, a lot of them have moved on to other more lucrative opportunities in the collectibles space, whether it's TCG, Pokemon, whatever you want to call it. So, with all that being said, I think the general idea around what people consider fair market value for a retro game has drastically shifted. And so now today, I think a lot of people are looking at 10 to 15% off as the standard, because, in a lot of cases, price charting, which is really where a lot of people go to get a general idea of the value of a game, price charting hasn't completely caught up to, I think, where the market is today. Now, don't get me wrong, price charting does do a good job. I think they've got some type of algorithm that updates the price of retro games in real time, because every day that, or every time, I should say, that I open up the Game My app, I see different games in my collection with either an up arrow signifying that the game has gone up in price, or a down arrow signifying that there is an overall downtrend in the market when it comes to the price of certain video games. And this isn't to say that all retro games are trending downward, because believe it or not, even in 2025, there are still games that are going up in price. There are still games that are even ballooning in price as certain people discover certain games, as certain YouTube videos come out, as certain movies come out, and different things of that nature. And then, of course, you have the impact of these different video game companies announcing delisting certain games, shutting down certain stores or online repositories for games. There's so many things that could impact the perceived value of a retro game, especially when people have a scarcity mindset. If the general public starts to think that they're no longer going to have access to certain games, then that can also boost up the price of certain games as well. So, but I think overall, in general, the idea of paying the market price for retro games is not something that's as appealing as collector as to as many collectors as it once was. And I think it's because a lot of collectors, they're in their mind, they're thinking, well, should I pay $70 for this game when maybe in 5 months it'll be 65, or maybe in 5 months it'll be 60? And I think that's the thought process that some collectors are having, especially when it comes to more expensive games or games that are on the higher end of, just value, right? A good example would be a game like Troubleshooter for the Sega Genesis. This was and still is one of the most expensive games on the Sega Genesis. And during the height of the pandemic, this was a $500 to $600 game. Well, that game has come down a lot in price. And when you look at, comps on, eBay, for instance, the ranges for this game range anywhere between like $250 and $300. And I believe the last time I checked, price charting had it in the twos, like the mid to high 200s. And I remember seeing a listing online for a really good copy that was in the 400 range. And I remember attempting to negotiate the price on the game, but the seller just was not willing to come down below, like say 380 or something like that. They were really hell bent on making sure that they got above 350 for the game, despite the market saying that the game wasn't really worth more than $280, $275. And I think once you start getting into that level of once you start getting to those levels of video games, that's really where things like condition come into factor. How clean is the manual, how clean is the cartridge, how clean is the case, and cover art, is it in like new condition. That's where a lot of those particulars come into play. And I think that's where those details start to separate different copies from themselves in terms of cleanliness, the how much of in a like new condition they are. And that's where those things happen. So I would say that with certain outliers, yeah, there might be people who are willing to pay well above market price for a game that's extremely rare, despite there being many copies of that game out in the wild. Because yeah, there might be 10,000 copies, but if 80% of the copies of that game are just in horrible shape, then it makes those 20,000 or 2,000, what, I forgot what numbers I just used. But my point is, if only 5% of the copies floating around of a game are actually in really good condition, then when you actually have one of those copies that are in really good condition, that's when you have more leverage as a seller. And those are things that I don't think price charting takes into account. Like, price charting doesn't really factor in condition. And I think that there are apps out there that do factor in condition when trying to formulate what the market value of certain games should be. But I just think because we're in that transitional period, people are a little bit more hesitant on just paying market value. Me, I'm the type of person that I don't necessarily mind paying market value depending on the game. But that's because I'm always curating my collection and buying games specifically to add into my collection. So if it's a game that I really want and it's in good condition and this is what the current market value is, then I will be willing to go ahead and pay that price. Because that's just what happens in all markets, right? If you look at buying a house, some people try to time the market. They say, well, I'll wait for the market to dip and I'll wait for home prices to drop down to a certain point. And then I'll go buy a house. But you could wait for home prices to drop to a certain point, but then who knows what else will change in the market once prices do drop. Would interest rates be, the same, or would they be higher? Is the inventory going to be available once market prices drop? Once market prices drop, what is the competition level going to be like, right? Because who knows how many other people are waiting for prices to drop. And then who's to say someone with more buying power than you won't be able to step in and take advantage and clean up on these lower prices. So I think when it comes to certain games that you might want in your collection, if it's a game you really want and it meets your standard of condition, then it might make sense to just pay whatever price you feel is fair for it, and not really go off of some reseller standard or some arbitrary percentage that you think you need to meet in order to future proof the value, or future proof the amount of investment you made into a game based on its value today. So I think it's a very interesting concept, and obviously it's one that's going to keep changing and evolving over time as the market continues to shift. But I'm interested to know your thoughts on paying market value or market price for retro games today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.